Hey everybody. So this is the explanation of the first Acme project, first weekend project, and basically what you're going to do, I'm going to give you the sort of setup here, but your goal is to have output that looks similar to this. It might seem a little bit confusing, but in the end, I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you some of the solution, and basically what you're going to be building is this file over here, the Acme DB file. And I'm going to go a little bit later and go into Webpack a bit to sort of help you out, show it to you. But in essence, this is the code that I'm going to give you. And so you're going to be importing this Acme DB from this Acme DB file. Again, we're going to be using ES6. You're going to have to set up Webpack in order to do it. You could do it without Webpack, in which case, instead of an import, you might do a require. And again, we'll sort of take a look at some other options if you weren't using ES6, but I think you should try to use ES6. It's going to be nice to do. So what I'm doing here is that I'm creating this constant of users. I've got one user named Mo. Notice Mo doesn't have an ID. And what I'm doing is creating my DB object. So const with ES6 basically says this object is not going to change. Instead of using var, I'm using const. If I tried to reassign something to DB, I'd get an error. And really what it ends up coming down to is use const when you can. And if you can't, because you're going to end up changing something, use let instead. And I'll give you some examples of this too when we start taking a look at Webpack and some ES6. So here, I'm creating this Acme DB, and I'm passing in users. Again, this is syntax that you might not be used to. Usually you would see users : users. But ES6 says if you just put in users, it assumes that what you want to name this thing is users, and it'll interpret this as users : users. So I'm basically passing in these users to Acme DB. You could see that if I do console.log db.users.length, it should be equal to 1. It's fairly simplistic. You could sort of imagine that if I'm passing these users in, I could then grab these users in my constructor and say, this.users equals users. But that should be pretty easy to implement. Here, though, you can see when I grab the first user, the ID is 1. So you're going to have to build something in here that loops over these users. There's only one here. I wouldn't hard code it, but because you're going to have to do it when you add other users, but you're going to basically have to look and say, hey, look, what's the maximum ID for all the users, and increase it by 1. And you'll see that in a little bit later. So the other thing is that DB should be able to add a user. So I add a user by just giving them a name. And you see, I also have a method, db show users. And what this does basically is just concatenates Mo and Larry. And you can actually see this is actually running over here. I'm just sort of showing you the code here. Also, there's going to be another method where you end up finding a user by ID. So I'm actually sort of proving here that when Larry got added, if I find Larry got added with an ID of 2, you can take my word for that. And if I end up saying db find by ID 2, and I look at the name, it's going to be Larry. So you're going to have to make sure every time that you add a user, what the goal is to basically find the maximum ID and to increment it by 1. So again, there were no users before. When Mo got added, when I constructed this, he had an ID of 1. When Larry gets added, he should have an ID of 2. I could then add another user, curly, and I also have a method called remove user by ID. So this is basically going to allow me to remove a user. We know that Mo had an ID of 1, so when I say remove user by ID, I should see that Mo is gone. And in fact, I could sort of prove that by saying db user 0.name is now Larry, right? Because Mo had been added with an ID of 1. I then added Larry. He would have had an ID of 2. I remove Mo. And so the first user in my object here is going to be Larry. I also have the ability to edit a user. When I edit a user, I've got to pass in the ID of the user. Again, I'm working with Larry. I'm misspelling his name over here with 2 A's. And now at this point, when I say show users, I end up getting this. So you really should build this up a little bit at a time. There's no tests here. So you could build it however way you want it, as long as you end up, getting the results. I mean, you could literally paste this code in to your index file and start building out, again, assuming once you end up getting Webpack working and that sort of thing, and build it out. And the only file that you should really have to work with is going to be this Acme-DB. And just to sort of show you the index file itself, the index file is going to be pretty simplistic. Again, we're using Webpack. I'm assuming that you're outputting it into dist bundle. I'm just using a simplistic HTTP server, which I'll demonstrate in a second. And I just have a style sheet in here. You don't have to use this because you're not really going to be outputting anything here. But I just have that for this demonstration so I can show you this, and it's kind of pretty. So that's what you're going to be building. Again, I would make every effort to get Webpack to work, set up a GitHub repo. It would be helpful if you named your repo Acme-Pre-Work. This way I can find it pretty easily once you end up giving me your GitHub accounts. And if you could work on this weekend and send me the link to your repo and even add me as a collaborator, I could go and take a look at it and give you some feedback on it, which I think will be helpful. And so I'm also going to go through Webpack one more time and maybe get you started with this a little bit more so it makes a little bit more sense.